Routine is often a mask for something much deeper, a quiet surface covering a turbulent ocean of secrets that most people are too busy to notice in their frantic rush toward an invisible finish line. Every morning, in the pale, amber light of dawn, I would walk through St. Jude's Park on my way to the office. The gravel crunched beneath my shoes in a rhythm that felt like the ticking of a cosmic clock. And every morning, without fail, I saw him. An elderly man with a tweed coat that seemed to absorb the very light around it and eyes that looked as if they had witnessed the birth and death of stars. He sat on the same weather-beaten wooden bench, a structure of salt-worn oak and peeling green paint, facing the heavy, iron gates of the local cemetery. My name is Leo, and I am a man of habits, perhaps to a fault. I'm a journalist by trade, a profession that demands I be curious and skeptical, but this man, Mason, was a puzzle that my mind simply couldn't set aside. He didn't read a newspaper to pass the time. He didn't toss breadcrumbs to the pigeons that gathered near his feet. He just sat there, stone still, clutching a small, leather-bound briefcase in his lap with a grip so tight his knuckles remained white against the dark hide. He stared at those cemetery gates with an intensity that felt almost holy, as if he were waiting for a ghost to walk through the iron bars and reclaim him. People in the neighborhood called him the Watcher, a local curiosity, but no one really knew the weight of what he was watching for. It wasn't just his presence that bothered me, it was the atmosphere around him. The light seemed to distort whenever you got too close, a subtle ripple in the air like heat rising from a desert road, and a low, rhythmic humming sound followed him, a vibration that you felt in your bones rather than heard with your ears. On my birthday, the universe decided to pull back the curtain. It was a cold, misty morning, the kind of day where the sky is a flat, oppressive gray and the fog clings to the trees like a damp shroud. As I hurried past, shielding my face from the biting wind, I noticed Mason wasn't in his usual state of stoic silence. He was breathing heavily, a labored, rasping sound that seemed to sync with the humming of the briefcase. And for the first time, the briefcase was partially open. I caught a glimpse of something inside, a glowing, glass-encased chronometer. It didn't tell time in hours or minutes, instead, it showed erratic, pulsing ripples of blue light that danced across its face like liquid lightning. I realized then that the bench wasn't a place of rest for him, it was a station, and he was a sentinel at the edge of a reality I was about to be pulled into. I spent the next week in a state of quiet obsession. As a journalist, I've interviewed everyone from politicians to survivors of disasters, but Mason's presence felt more meaningful than any headline I had ever written. I started changing my own routine, taking my coffee on a nearby bench, trying to blend into the scenery while keeping a sharp eye on him. I watched the way his weathered fingers would trace the edge of the briefcase, touching it with a reverence usually reserved for a loved one's skin. I noticed that whenever the humming grew louder, the shadows of the trees would stretch and twist in directions that defied the position of the sun. He was waiting for something, a specific alignment of forces that had been fractured since the Great Collapse. I decided to do some digging into the town's ancient archives, driven by a need to understand the history of that specific spot in the park. I discovered that the bench he occupied stood exactly where a massive research facility had once been located before it vanished during the Great Collapse. The records were fragmented, but they spoke of a project designed to ground the timeline, to prevent reality from drifting into chaos. There were mentions of a mechanical heart link, a device that required a human observer to function. I began to wonder if Mason was the last of his kind, a relic of a forgotten era. But the chronometer, the glowing, pulsating dial I had seen, suggested that the project wasn't history, it was still active, and he was the one holding it together. One afternoon, the air heavy with the scent of ozone, I finally worked up the courage to bridge the gap between us. I walked over and sat on the far end of his bench. The atmosphere around him felt tangibly different, it was heavy, almost pressurized, and the humming was so intense it made my teeth ache. He didn't look at me, but I could feel his awareness, a sharp, cold focus that made the hair on my arms stand up. "The ripples are growing stronger today, Leo," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. My heart didn't just skip a beat, it felt like it stopped entirely. I had never introduced myself. I had never spoken a word to him. How did he know who I was? The impossibility of it sent a cold shiver down my spine that felt like ice water. He finally turned his head to look at me, and his eyes were like two shards of polished blue glass, piercing through my confusion. "You've been watching the distortion for half a lifetime, even if you didn't know what you were looking at," he said, his eyes never wavering. "It's only fair that the distortion has been watching you too." He opened the briefcase fully, and there it was, the chronometer, a masterpiece of brass and light. Beside it lay a heavy brass compass whose needle spun wildly in circles, never finding north. "This is the heart link," he whispered. "It's not a watch, and it's not a map. It's a tether. Reality is a ghost, Leo, and it's trying to walk away from us. I am the anchor that keeps it from drifting into the void." "Who are you?" I whispered, my coffee cup trembling. Mason let out a dry, hollow laugh. "I am the last custodian of the Great Collapse." He explained that decades ago, the fabric of time had been torn, leaving our world as a series of disconnected fragments held together by sheer willpower and these devices. Clara, the woman who had designed the heart link, had vanished into the first ripple. She had left him behind to maintain the balance. He wasn't sitting there out of grief, he was sitting there because his very presence acted as a ground for the timeline. If he left his post, the park, the town, and everyone in it would dissolve into a sea of non-existence. The ripples in the air intensified as he spoke. The iron gates across the street began to flicker, turning into the glass doors of a laboratory that hadn't existed for decades. I saw people in white coats moving behind the glass, their faces blurred like a corrupted video file. They were screaming, but no sound came through the rift. With a sharp, rhythmic click from the chronometer, the vision vanished. "I'm tired, Leo," he whispered, his shoulders slumping. "My own heart link is failing. The device needs a new anchor, someone whose mind is sharp and whose soul is still tethered to the present. I've waited since the Great Collapse for someone who could see the ripples instead of just the rain." The reality of the situation crashed over me like a tidal wave. All those years I thought I was a journalist observing the world, and all that time I was just a character in a reality that Mason was desperately trying to keep from unraveling. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a leather-bound ledger. It was heavy, its edges worn by decades of use, and embedded in the center of the cover was a glowing dial, identical to the one in the chronometer. "This is the manual, and this is the key," he said, his voice growing fainter. "You don't read it, you feel it. To stabilize the world, you must place your hand on this dial. You must ground the timeline with your own consciousness." He handed me the ledger, and as my palm touched the glowing dial, I felt a jolt of raw, terrifying energy. It wasn't electricity, it was memory. I saw 1,000 different versions of my own life, 1,000 different paths I could have taken, all swirling in a vortex of blue light. My mind felt like it was being stretched across eternity. Mason placed his hand over mine, his touch cold and brittle. "Stay focused, Leo. Don't let the ripples pull you in. Just ground yourself in the here and now." The humming in the air reached a crescendo, a deafening roar that seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth. I felt a surge of pure, animal panic, the urge to throw the ledger away and run. But then I looked at Mason. He was smiling, a peaceful, weary smile. "She's calling me," he whispered, looking toward the cemetery gates which were now shimmering with an ethereal, white light. I've held the line for so long, but now it's your turn to watch the shadows. He closed his eyes, and the humming from his own briefcase suddenly stopped, replaced by a profound, heavy silence. His hand fell away from mine, and he became still, a statue of a man who had finally finished his long walk through time. I was alone. The park felt hollow, the air thin and fragile. I sat there on the salt-worn oak bench, my hand pressed firmly against the glowing dial on the ledger. I watched the gates. At exactly 10:42 a.m., the world began to tilt. The trees started to turn into pillars of light, and the gravel at my feet began to dissolve into mist. I felt the timeline drifting, pulling away from the anchor. My breath hitched. I remembered Mason's final instruction. I closed my eyes and focused every ounce of my will on the sensation of the wood beneath me, the cold rain on my skin, and the steady pulse of the dial under my palm. I pushed back against the chaos. The glowing dial beneath my hand flared with a brilliant, blinding blue light. I felt a click deep in my chest, a mechanical alignment that felt like a gear slotting into place. The distortion vanished. The pillars of light turned back into trees, and the mist solidified into gravel. The world was stable again. I realized then that my old life, my career as a journalist, my pursuit of trivial stories, it was all gone. I had inherited a responsibility that was invisible to the world but essential for its survival. I had become the new anchor, the ground for a timeline that was always trying to escape. I stayed on that bench until the sun went down. People walked past me, some glancing with pity at the young man sitting in the rain with a dead old man, others ignoring the scene entirely as they hurried to their warm homes. I saw a young boy playing nearby with a ball. He didn't know that his laughter was only possible because I was sitting there, grounding his reality with my own. I learned that day that true heroism isn't about the headlines or the fame, it's about holding the line in total silence. Decades have passed since that morning. I am now the one in the tweed coat, my hair as white as the frost on the grass. The leather-bound ledger is always in my lap, its glowing dial a constant companion. I look at the young man sitting on the bench across from me today. He's been watching me for 3 years, trying to solve the puzzle of the old man and the briefcase. Tomorrow, I think I'll call him over. Tomorrow, I'll show him how to save the world. The greatest secrets aren't the ones we keep from the world to protect ourselves, but the ones we keep for the world to protect its very existence. We all think we are the masters of our time, but in reality, we are just the keepers of the moments that someone else was brave enough to ground for us. As the gates across the street begin to shimmer once more, I reach for the dial, my hand steady, my heart at peace, knowing that the gears will keep aligning, one ripple at a time, long after I am gone into the light.